Hello, and welcome to my thesis presentation called Hypermodular Reconstruction of Film Environments. For today's agenda, I'm going to be going over a brief overview of my artifact and the three mastery topics, the demo, the first pillar of hypermodularity, sci-fi set design, and atmospherics and lightings, and then going to break down the retrospectives of the project and then answer some questions later on. For this thesis topic, I wanted to recreate a level from the ship called the Nostromo from the movie Alien 1979, and specifically the level B deck. And for the artifact, I wanted to include two types of corridors, one with the style from the movie and try to recreate the details that the movie had. And then the second corridor, I wanted to include my own imagination to kind of capture a seamless transition for the environment that would be played inside Unreal Engine 4. For the first pillar about hypermodularity, I wanted to research trim sheets and decal sheets because the industry uses these texture techniques to create environments, especially hard surface related environments, because you can just reuse all these textures so fluidly to create assets and just entire environments. The second pillar, the movie set design. I wanted to research Ridley Scott, who was the visionary that kind of changed the way the audience kind of viewed sci-fi movies. And I wanted to research what about his set design really captures people's attentions. And then the last pillar would be atmospheric lighting for sci-fi. I think that lighting is such a key feature in any environments, and the lighting tropes for sci-fi, just designs in general, I wanted to research what kind of captures that element inside any films or games. So to go with that, I wanted to research how I can change the moods for my scenes inside the engine. This is the artifact that I wanted to create, or the blueprint that Adam Savage Hill was able to kind of like draw out. And I wanted to create level B because it's such a unseen kind of level of the audience. Most of the people who created these kind of levels and just other fan-made stuff, they kind of go for the main level, which has like the famous Nostromo bridge and just other factors that people recognize more. And I wanted to explore an area that people haven't really seen. And why don't we just jump in straight into the demo? So this is my level inside Unreal Engine 4 that I've created. And I wanted to create this scene to be an explorable environment where the player could kind of walk around and interact with just the scene and kind of like observe the details that I came up with, and also try to mimic the lighting scenarios that the movie had to offer. I wanted to research and understand more of the modular systems and how I can apply it into games, and just kind of create a one-for-one aspect of the film into a playable environment. Now in this environment, I wanted to also play around with kind of scenarios where I could try out instances where events could have different lighting scenarios. And this is an example of kind of like a horror sequence that could be incorporated if this project was pushed a bit further. But it allows me to create these different lighting scenarios where it causes more tense moments and allows me to capture different lighting scenarios once again. And then now for the different part of the corridors that has my own imagination incorporated into it, I wanted to study the shape language that the Nostromo already had before. And one of the details that came across my research was that the Nostromo isn't particularly designed to be like super futuristic compared to like movies like Star Wars or Star Trek. The film directors and art directors wanted to kind of move away from that and create a scene that was more believable so that the audience could be more involved and kind of recognize shapes that they've seen before. And for this corridor, I wanted to kind of make it a seamless transition where people could be like, oh, this could fit into the scene pretty well if they were to just walk around it without knowing what the Nostromo looked like originally. And I used same exact texture sheets, the decal sheets and trim sheets to create this kind of shapes and assets for my own personal corridor. The idea was that I wouldn't have to retexture things. I just had to remodel stuff and just make new shapes if I wanted to really quickly. Now moving on to other parts of the environment. Here we're arriving towards the med bay, and I wanted to create this med bay because it's such an iconic part of the movie where one of the first face huggers was discovered on one of the actors, and I think that it really captured one of those moments where people would remember. So that's why I created this part. And ideally, this part of the environment would be filled with a lot more assets. But the goal was to create a more of a modular kind of a design aspect to match the master pillar. Now, for the going back to the beginning of the environment, I arrived at the suit locker room, and the famous Wayland suits that the movie had would be hung on these kind of like lockers right here, and the rest of the environment pretty much could be interchanged around with different other modular pieces for the sake of trying to play around with different combinations of corridor segments or corridor pillars and just details inside other modeling softwares as well. And now going into the research, for the transformations of the scenes and just throughout the process of creating this level, I need to go back to talking about what the design goals for moments, for different milestones, such as vertical slice. For vertical slice, my goal was to deliver a scene of two corridors, one of my own and one of matching the movie. And the idea of this was to kind of understand the technology and my own kind of process of how I would come across making my assets, and I needed to also deliver some kind of lighting scenario that would be kind of like to a final level of satisfaction. And then going into alpha and beta, for alpha, the requirements was to actually deliver the entire environment, and one of the key differences you'll see here is that the lighting scenarios in alpha was pretty monotone, and I think that one of the factors that I didn't include during alpha was the transition between just a simple corridor into an entire environment, and that didn't really translate well when I had my lighting scenario and lighting settings, and a lot of details were lost. So during beta, I was able to go back and kind of like retune and restart the lighting settings that I had to kind of like match more colors back into the scene. And then more screenshots of differences between alpha and beta. You can see like there's a lot more cool colors involved, and just more differences with the shadows around the edges to indicate some more depth between like the details. So for the first mastery pillar regarding hypermodularity, the trim sheet and the decal sheets that I used were these two mainly for the whole scene, and I wanted to go with this idea of creating as much as I could with as little as I had, and it kind of touches on the subject of Star Citizen's hard surface workflow that I researched, because their model is to create entire environments and assets using the same detail sheets and trim sheets that the artists make. And this idea of not having to bake down their assets for every asset that they make, it really saves up on so much time. And as an artist, during a game development cycle, time is the most important factor, and they are able to achieve such quality work because of this workflow they have when they make their hard surface details. Now, going into how to make a trim sheet for my research, I had to research like what the metrics would be for the modeling aspect, and when I'm trying to bake down these details into texture maps. One of the most common details and numbers that a lot of artists agreed on was just trying to stay within the power of 2 kind of setup. And this is important because in a hard surface environment and this very futuristic metallic kind of detail, things are very, very specific, and they have to follow a consistency all throughout the environment, or else the modularity can break pretty easily. So that's why, for me, what worked when I was modeling these details was staying within 8 centimeters as the minimum and 16 centimeters as the most comfortable kind of detail section. As you can see on this picture, each square in the 3D modeling software is a 16-meter height, and it really captured a lot of the details that I needed if I try to stay within these boundaries. Anything smaller than the 8 centimeter horizontally would kind of not be captured correctly and baked correctly, and things would come out more blurry than usual. Now, for the actual height of the details, I needed to maintain a consistency of 4 centimeters for the height map that I would be trying to bake out, or else the details would come out very odd because of the parallax occlusion mapping method that I'll be explaining later on. For my baking choice, I decided to use marmoset because of its power and very comfortable customization. I needed to be able to adjust the height data or not the height data, but the cage for each trim detail that I had. As you can see on the left side of the picture, there is about probably 10 different plus trim details, and each one had a different kind of like amount of texture detail that I wanted to focus on. So I could adjust the cage if I needed to. But luckily for this trim, because I followed that strict 4 centimeter height, it was more comfortable to kind of work with without having to adjust each single cage. And then the different colors that you've seen in the past few pictures indicate me setting a different color to set up an ID map inside Marmoset that could later be exported into a Substance Painter for me to paint each detail with a different texture with much ease. Some details I wanted different metals, and some details I wanted to have the same metals, the textures. So I was able to quickly just kind of color pick the details to share the same details. And then for the application inside Max, once the textures were baked, I would be able to kind of like cut the plane into little smaller subplanes and use those kind of like as stickers that would go onto actual meshes, because the idea was that I would be using parallax occlusion mapping, which brings a height data into the meshes, and it would look like actual geo inside the meshes. And then you can see here on the right side of the image where those meshes have the details, but they're all just planes, and sometimes I had to actually model some extra stuff, but ultimately they still carry the same stickers inside them. And this application of the Star Citizen workflow really helped out with just development of a lot of knickknacks for the hard surface details inside the scene. Now, to kind of showcase what I mean by like cutting out different pieces and like using them as like stickers almost, as you can see, like all those knickknacks can be moved very freely and placed inside the various different assets with ease, and I could move around kind of hard surface details anywhere I wanted with ease without having to rebake another low poly to or high poly to low poly kind of workflow compared to the traditional style. Now for the application of the trim and decals of kind of like where things went on the left picture with the original kind of design, I researched where what details were the common details from the film and what other artists agreed on, and created my trim sheet based on those kind of findings, and then created on the right side my own kind of like little corridor scene using the exact same textures, but the application of those trim sheets and decal sheets were used more freely, and it just goes to show the power of trying to be creative and being able to reuse these textures so easily. Now for the height data importance that I kept talking about and why it's so important to maintain these metrics, because the height map is the most important value for the Star Citizen workflow and the parallax occlusion mapping kind of method inside Unreal Engine, because it simulates a lot of details with more depth, and if I didn't have this height map kind of like the way I wanted it, with more of a gray value that's not too exaggerated, then the details would look much more artifacty and just would not come out the way I wanted it. So inside Marmoset, you actually have to adjust the height values and distances for where you want the starting point to kind of come in. So for example, like white would mean it's at its middle point or highest point, and then black is the deepest part. And then now inside of Unreal, when we actually start to use parallax occlusion mapping, you can see there's about 6 or 7 values that all correspond to the height data, and you can control where the reference plane is. Like for example here, so 0.5 would mean that gray is the starting point of the details, and anything white would mean that it's a protruding kind of detail, and anything dark would be going inwards and include some more depth. This is an example of what the details look like inside the Unreal Engine, and you can see like the map currently only uses ambient occlusion data, and it really shows the depth of some of the details with certain angles, and I needed to capture this kind of depth because I wanted to kind of optimize the meshes without having to actually create all these details and trying to fake it with this POM data instead. And then this is an example of like what a normal map versus the parallax occlusion mapping would look like. On the left, you have the parallax details and actual depth to it with pretty accurate kind of like representation of what a metal grading would look like. But on the right, you can see like it just looks very plain, and you would, in an actual scenario, like you would want to actually model out these kind of details. And then there was a lot of research that went into this, because parallax occlusion mapping can be tricky if not done correctly and cause a lot of artifacts, such as on the left, where I try to create a lot of metal gratings with just the plane and see if I can fake all those details. But you can tell that like along the edges, those details kind of really don't work out well. And a lot of this is because sometimes you just want to straight up model things out. It's not worth it to try to fake as much as you can. It just won't look out correctly. And on the right side, you can see that at the edges of the planes, like you can start seeing the neighboring trim sheet details, and that's because of what I mentioned earlier about how where you want the reference plane to start. And at that point, when I tried this out, the reference point that I set it out to was at a value where at an angle you could start seeing the details of the neighboring trim details. Now going into sci-fi set design, first things that I needed to understand was the terminology and the goals that the art director and the kind of like other screenplay writers kind of use to describe what the alien and Nostromo look was going for. And Roger Christian, who was art director for Alien, and he also worked on Star Wars 2 years prior to this film. He went from working on a very pristine kind of like set dressing and very romanticized kind of like view of the future to this very modern, oily, gritty, and more of a realistic kind of scenario. And he mentioned that it was a lot more interesting to be able to recreate what a futuristic and achievable future kind of like spaceship is. And the Nostromo is actually a kind of like a mining facility and spaceship. That's why they were able to focus in on all this very dirty and kind of like wet kind of look to it. And the idea was that they wanted to make it as claustrophobic as possible because it is a space horror film. The philosophy behind the set design, a lot of it comes from trying to follow as much realism as possible with the current modern kind of like props that they had. And at the time in 1978, they were able to reuse a bunch of World War II components to create their sets. And many people really recognize a bunch of the shapes that the film has to offer. If you can see at the bottom right, the early design of the Nostromo Command Bridge, it's so cluttered and filled with detail, and it just resembles like a mess compared to the clean kind of like bridges that you could see in Star Trek or Star Wars. And they wanted to really go in this opposite direction towards a romanticized kind of view of what the future could look like. And then the one of the most influential people throughout the development of this film was Ron Cobb, who was one of the concept artists and graphic designers for the film. He was one of the ones in charge of creating what the interior could look like, and also he was famous for the semiotic standard, which is one of the inspirations for many things, such as the iPhone kind of like app, logo stuff. And you can see on the right side, like early designs of the ship, they all maintain some kind of like futuristic look, but everything's kind of like cluttered and exposed, because with the idea of a very pristine environment like Star Wars, where things are kind of hid behind panels, people don't really understand, what those are for. They look cool, but using this idea of form follows function, with having pipes exposed or every little detail kind of exposed, people understand that there is a purpose for all of these details. For my design and trying to follow an actual playable environment, one of the biggest issues during this development was the sense of scale. I had trouble with understanding modularity with an idea of playing around with octagonal shapes and trying to make it into like a very design-friendly choice inside Unreal, because things have to snap in a grid kind of scale, and also things had to play and feel correct. And one of the things was that during the early prototyping phases, when I had playtesters kind of like walk through my walkouts, things just felt too claustrophobic when I was trying to match the film, and the way that people kind of walked around, it just didn't feel fun at all. And so at that point, without consolidating with the advisor, I scaled the world by 1.5 times bigger, and every asset was kind of increased. And also, this led to so many problems because everything just kind of like looked ginormous, obviously, and two, like it just really didn't match the movie kind of reference at all. But the reason why I did this was because looking at Alien Isolation, one of the games that really pretty much uses this same movie kind of like set. When I was playing around it, some of their corridors look much larger than the actual films, and that's because to kind of cater towards gameplay, you have to distort what the actual reality is. But for this project, I decided to forego that and actually just try to go for the movie 1-to-1 ratio instead. One of the problems that kind of like came about was the details were so large. I would have to resort to creating extra detail to kind of match the eye level of the scenes, and instead of doing that, I just decided to revert it back. And then one of the other issues that I encountered early was the sense of having extra corridor joints to kind of like add more variety, but this kind of increased some artificial length towards my scene, and I really needed to avoid this because in this example, in this blueprint here, each joint was at least 16 centimeters long, and one of them was 32 centimeters long. But the distance between these two actual rooms should always remain the same for this kind of like 45-degree kind of like hallway, because this will always be the same length. But if I artificially increase the length, it would mess up the modularity, and there ended up being holes inside the environment. For the atmospherics portion of my mastery, I was able to quickly learn how difficult lighting could be if I decided to add lights for each single kind of emissive inside the scene. So the first picture shows the completely overexposed kind of lighting because I added a light source to each single emissive, and the result was, as you can see, like a completely nasty and overexposed scene. But then I found out about using emissive to static lights inside Unreal Engine, and this allowed me to delete every single light that was put and use the emissives as the actual sources of lights to create more of a natural look of where the lighting could kind of bounce off of. So I didn't have to completely worry about placing extra lights or anything like that. I just had to control the settings of those lights or those emissives, and the result kind of matches the movie shot in the bottom right. So for the film, Ridley Scott loves to always follow certain formats. One of them is the anamorphic format, which is the black bars above and below the kind of like film, and this kind of aids the claustrophobic nature that Alien really tries to push for because of the horror kind of factor into it. They also use a bunch of volumetric fogs and just fogs in their sets to kind of to allow the lights to kind of bounce around even more. And you can see in this kind of like comparison shot or this breakdown shot for the movie Prometheus, they have the movie set where the lighting in the background is a fight between warm and cool lights, and the actors themselves are also wearing clothes that represent warm and cool colors. They use this constantly throughout the film to kind of distinguish between tense and relaxing moments as well. To break down warm and cool lights even more, the warm lights usually indicate safety or emotionally positive feelings, and cool lights go for more of a sterile clinical vibe. And what this means in the environment is that I wanted to be able to control where I wanted the audience to feel more of a tense kind of like walkthrough moment or a relaxed state. as they walk. Kind of like in the middle of the rooms, it would be more of a warm setting, but in the corridors, it'd be more of a cool color. And then how does this represent mastery? I think that being able to be updated with the current industry standards of how hard surface assets are used, and it really shows the understanding of fast workflow and being able to create details and assets quickly. Understanding of shape language and the success that films like Ridley Scott's Alien, how it kind of captured the world's appeal to it, and be able to captivate the mood of an environment as well. And how can this be taken forward? I think that if there was more technical art elements involved into the scene, it would be much more of an interactable environment to play around with and explore. Having more props into the scene would bring the life of the level to a completely new level. And then incorporating a fear element, I think, would be one of the coolest factors to include in the film, such as Alien, because it is, after all, a space horror movie. And then for the retrospectives, what went well is learning how to problem solve a lot about issues with modularity, mainly. I was really challenged throughout the project trying to understand how I could snap things and work towards a designer kind of mindset. And then also learning industry standard techniques. I think it really was a great kind of journey to reach out to other artists from the industry to ask them for elaboration on what they do for their projects. And then what went wrong was, I think the worst was time management, because applying research and application to the project, if I fell behind on the research and couldn't apply the stuff, it would affect the pillars very, very drastically, and I had to find ways to catch up. And I was also overall pretty stressed with the trying to match the reference completely, because I felt very limited in my artistic freedom until I had my own corridor section to build, because trying to catch details from such an old film and blurry pictures, it became pretty hard at some point, and I didn't want to just create my own kind of imagination details. And then for my personal growth, I think that it was a really interesting kind of like viewpoint to see how the development of this project throughout 1 year, it really, I was fighting constant burnout, and it was amazing to kind of experience how important it is to rely on other people to point you back to the right direction. So I think that it was a really great experience to kind of like go through the positives and to the ups and downs of the kind of environment process. And these are the references, and thank you for tuning in to my thesis presentation.